Titanic, built to be unsinkable. Her captain and crew, the finest of their day. The night, moonless, still and calm, crystal clear.
Eyes ahead!
And yet, the greatest maritime disaster in history. The indestructible, destroyed, and abandoned by a nearby ship.
It seems impossible to believe that the captain and officers knew of our distress and deliberately ignored it.
Many questions still surround that night. Among them, the biggest and most crucial mystery of all. Why? How could this have happened at all?
So she's at Titanic's wreck site. That's incredible.
He's traveled the world, collected data, examined thousands of hours of testimony.
The more I read about the truth of what happened, the more I realize how strange it really was.
For the first time ever, new research will help explain the mysteries behind the tragedy. Tim Moulton is one of the world's foremost experts on the Titanic. His journey to uncover the truth behind the tragedy has taken him across the world. Here in Las Vegas is the object of his lifelong quest. Dragged up from the ocean floor in 1998 and put on exhibition amongst the casinos, showgirls, and magic acts. "15 tons of the hull of the Titanic, pulled up from 2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic. Bringing up and exhibiting a piece of the wreckage is highly controversial. But to Tim, it's a chance to stand face to face with history.
She's here. This is the Titanic. This is what was built in Belfast 100 years ago. And this is a testament to how beautifully built she was. She's like a work of art. Every rivet, literally handcrafted. It's extraordinary to be standing this close to it. It's almost as though Titanic's come back from the dead and sort of hit me in the face almost, because she's here.
Tim has devoted his life to understanding what really happened that night in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. As a piece of machinery, Titanic seems invincible.
What you can see here from this 15-ton piece of the Titanic is the strength of it, just the sheer... We don't build things like this today anymore. The way its heaviness, its strength, the way the rivets were heat sealed into it and shrunk onto this very thick shell plating here. And even over here, you can see the glass. The thickness of the glass is absolutely amazing. I mean, that is nearly 2 inches thick. This ship is built like a battleship.
1909 is a remarkable year. The world's biggest and strongest ship, symbol of the might of the Industrial Revolution, begins to take shape. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, Titanic's keel is laid. At the same time, 2,000 miles away in the ice fields of Greenland, an armada is launched. Thousands of icebergs are carving off from the glaciers and begin making their way south towards the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. By April 1912, the unsinkable Titanic is being crewed by the best mariners in the world, with passengers determined to be part of the maiden voyage. Back in London, Tim surrounds himself with all the available scientific and historical research he needs to plot and understand that night, moment by moment.
Over the years, Titanic has become a myth, and as we go on, we get further and further away from the truth. And what I wanted to do is wind the clock back to 1912, to almost put myself in that position there, and to really learn about the environment as well, and to find out exactly what happened that night.
Tim has been obsessed with Titanic since he was a child. To help him understand it better, he even rebuilt the ship for himself.
When I was about 11 years old, I got some glue and plans and cut them up, and just actually gluing them onto cardboard and actually starting to see the profile of Titanic come to life off the page. It really makes the Titanic become a real ship that you understand the geography of.
Tim built his model using the plans of Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. The designs were so similar that there were no blueprints for Titanic herself. But now, based on first-hand accounts from survivors and the reconstruction made after her discovery on the ocean floor, Tim has this complete, accurate layout of the ship. In her day, Titanic is the largest moving object ever made. She is 1/6 of a mile long, 175 feet high, and divided into 11 decks. The top deck houses the navigating bridge. The next 5 decks include exquisite first-class staterooms and luxurious architecture, such as the spectacular grand staircase. The bottom 3 decks are reserved for crew, cargo, and machinery. This extraordinary vessel was moved through the water by 3 giant propellers, which were powered by engines generating nearly 60,000 horsepower.
Titanic was a floating city, capable of carrying 3,500 people, and she had fabulous facilities. She had a squash court 2 decks deep, she had a swimming pool, and she even had a gymnasium complete with a rowing machine.
The first-class dining saloon is located in the center of D-Deck. It is one of the most stable positions on the ship. One more detail designed to maximize the comfort of the passengers. Finally, on the 10th of April 1912, Titanic raises anchor and sets sail. Destination, New York. With a maximum speed of more than 23 knots and a weight of 46,000 tons, Titanic's journey begins. But from the very start, there are ominous signs.
One of the lesser-known facts about the Titanic is there was a fairly serious coal bunker fire raging in Titanic that began at Belfast, where the Titanic was built, and they put out the fire on Saturday night. So it took them nearly the whole voyage to get the fire under control.
Titanic is carrying passengers from every class of society. Hundreds of immigrants from many countries, British citizens who are hoping to make a new life in America. Others returning home after holidaying in Europe. Colonel Archibald Gracie IV was a graduate of West Point Military Academy. He was traveling first class back to New York.
I enjoyed myself as if I were in a summer palace on the seashore, surrounded with every comfort. There was nothing to suggest that we were on the stormy Atlantic Ocean. The motion of the ship, noise of its machinery, scarcely discernible on deck or in the saloons, day or night.
Despite its huge scale, the true genius of Titanic is in its details. It is as genteel as the finest cafes on the continent. On the lower deck, freezer stores mean that the restaurants and cafes are stocked with the finest fresh produce. The Café Parisien out on B deck is accompanied by a view of the North Atlantic passing by the French windows, a first on any ship. Inside in the restaurant, the first-class à la carte menu has 11 courses, including oysters, sirloin of beef, peaches in chartreuse jelly, and chocolate and vanilla desserts. Other luxuries are equally suited to the fitness fanatic, Colonel Gracie.
And when Sunday morning came, I considered it high time to begin my customary exercises, and determined to patronize for the rest of the voyage the squash racket court, the swimming pool, the gymnasium, etc. I was up early, before breakfast, preparatory to a swim in the 6-foot deep tank of salt water, heated to a refreshing temperature. In no swimming bath had I ever enjoyed such pleasure before. How curtailed that enjoyment would have been had the presentiment come to me, telling how near it was to being my last plunge, and that before dawn of another day, I would be swimming for my life in mid-ocean.
All this time, the ice field has been making its way further south and is now completely blocking the shipping lanes. The deadly icebergs and field ice are a looming threat directly ahead of Titanic. Meanwhile, the passengers are enjoying their trip, safe in the knowledge that they aren't on a brave adventure into the unknown. They're so confident because the North Atlantic liner routes are as reliable as railway lines. Thousands of ships regularly cross from east to west and back, with set routes known as steamer tracks. Titanic's journey will take exactly 7 days.
For a lot of people in first class, for example, business people, they might do this journey once a month, for example. They were always doing it, and they didn't expect it to be a trip into the unknown. They expected to arrive on Wednesday morning, and that was it.
It's Sunday, the 14th of April, 6:30 p.m. Titanic has her lookouts high up in the crow's nest. Other ships on the steamer tracks had radioed warnings of the ice ahead. She's on alert, but traveling full steam ahead, confident that she can cope. Today, it's inconceivable that a ship could be steaming into an area of ice protected only by the eyesight of its lookouts. One of the reasons is the existence of the International Ice Patrol, which tracks the path of icebergs in the North Atlantic. The International Ice Patrol was set up as a direct consequence of the disaster. Oceanographer Don Murphy is their chief scientist.
Don, I'm interested to know, where do the icebergs come from and how long do they take to get there?
The icebergs in the western North Atlantic, the ones that enter the shipping lanes, come primarily from the west coast of Greenland. And then down the coast and eventually along the coast of Labrador, and then towards the shipping lanes and into the area where they become a very severe danger to the North Atlantic mariner.
The freezing swathe of water that carries the icebergs is called the Labrador Current. In the 2-year journey south, the water keeps the icebergs dangerously large for a dangerously long time. Eventually, this frigid current, with its deadly cargo, cuts into the warmer Gulf Stream.
We do know that 1912 was a very severe iceberg year. Over 1,000 icebergs entered the North Atlantic shipping lanes during 1912. The average is a lot less than that, around 500 a year is the average. So it was a very severe iceberg year. The existence of so many icebergs does give us the understanding that the Labrador Current was bringing a large number of these from the north into the shipping lanes. And one of the things that we have to be very careful about is the location of these Labrador Current areas that have relatively very, very cold water in it, and of course preserve an iceberg.
Today, we have the technology that would warn a ship of the exact whereabouts of the icebergs it's heading towards. April 14th, 1912, 10 p.m. In a short space of time, it's gone from warm weather to freezing cold. The water is calm and a blanket of stars fills the sky. The air is clear as far as the horizon. Perfect visibility. The entire safety of the ship now depends on her watch officers and the lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee.
Another thing that's been blamed for the Titanic disaster is that the lookouts didn't have binoculars. And it is true that binoculars were scheduled to be in the crow's nest, but they weren't in it for that journey. However, having read all of the inquiries and listened to testimony from the captains of all the major transatlantic liners, what I know is that the best way of spotting ice at night is with the naked eye. And the last thing the officers on the Titanic wanted was the lookouts messing up with binoculars.
Titanic and other ships in the White Star Line prided themselves on having a dedicated lookout crew. In clear visibility with the naked eye, they should be able to spot an iceberg on the horizon. That means at least 20 minutes warning. If there is anything out there, the captain will know about it in time.
What they wanted was a quick 3 sharp rings of the bell, which means an object dead ahead.
For some of Titanic's passengers, the bars and restaurants offer entertainment well into the evening. For others, like schoolteacher Lawrence Beasley, it's time to turn in. He's in his cabin on D-deck.
The quietness of the night was broken only by the muffled sounds that came to me through the ventilators of stewards talking and moving along the corridors. Nearly all of the passengers were in their cabins, some asleep in bed, others undressing, and others only just down from the smoking room and still discussing many things.
On the bridge, Titanic's engines are at full speed ahead. Now traveling at more than 22 knots, she's almost at top speed.
One of the most common explanations that people give for the cause of the Titanic disaster is that she was going too fast. And yet, when you look at the evidence, what you see is that captain after captain testifies to having experienced it to be totally safe to keep to full speed in ice in clear weather.
Another version posits that Captain Smith is drunk on duty, but it's his firm policy never to drink while at sea. He's one of the finest captains, given responsibility for the greatest ship. His popularity is such that he's called the millionaire's captain, and he's doing everything by the book.
That night, the weather was completely clear, so Captain Smith was doing only what all the other captains would have been doing, which is keeping a sharp lookout.
They're being extra vigilant because of the warnings from other ships. Tonight, a smaller 450-foot steamer, the Californian, has passed 3 large icebergs and radioed a warning to all ships. Titanic acknowledges the message. Now at about 10:30 p.m., the Californian finds herself blocked by a huge ice barrier, almost 30 miles long and 3 miles wide. She is captained by Stanley Lord. He's one of the youngest and most promising captains on the North Atlantic. Soon after he stopped at the ice barrier, he notices a ship approaching.
Evening, officer.
Evening, sir.
When I came off the bridge at 10:30, I pointed out to the officer that I thought I saw a light coming along. And it was a most peculiar night. And we had been making mistakes all along with the stars, thinking they were signals.
She appears to have no wireless.
We could not distinguish where the sky ended and the water commenced. You understand, it was a flat calm. He said he thought it was a star, and I did not say anything more.
Let's go to the
And I said, let us go to the wireless and see what the news is. But I met the operator coming. And I said, do you know of anything around? He said, only the Titanic. And I said, to me, it doesn't look like the Titanic. There's no doubt about it.
Lord is convinced that he's looking at a small steamer and is sure that, unlike Titanic, it doesn't have radio. He tells his radio operator to put in another call to Titanic, which must be elsewhere. In Titanic's radio room, the operator is under pressure. The ship has just arrived close enough to the United States to begin sending telegrams direct to shore. And there's a huge backlog of messages. In order to hear the distant signal, Jack Phillips has turned his headphones up to full volume. On the Californian, Cyril Evans types out his warning. But he has no idea how close Titanic is. His ears ringing, Phillips has no patience for any interruptions. Evans has done his best to relay his warning. His 16-hour shift ends and he leaves his post for the night. He is the only radio operator on the Californian. Titanic is now only about 10 miles from the Californian, but cut off from the nearest source of rescue. It is 11:30 p.m. Titanic is steaming through a massive ice field in the darkness, confident that she can see an iceberg in time to avoid it. But just 10 minutes later, her luck runs out.
Ice ahead! Ice ahead! Ice ahead!
The iceberg isn't 20 minutes away. They spot it when it's almost on top of them. Something has gone terribly wrong. On the bridge, the crew put the engines into reverse and turned the wheel to avoid the iceberg. Despite her size, the Titanic is highly maneuverable. Instead of slamming straight into the iceberg, it manages to begin turning away. The hidden ice shelf rips along Titanic's hull. The Titanic is so large, many passengers have little idea of what is happening. Lawrence Beasley is on D-deck, near the stern of the ship.
There came to me what seemed nothing more than an extra heave of the engines. Nothing else. No sense of shock, no jar that felt like one heavy body meeting another. The thought came to me that they must still have further increased the speed. And all this time, the Titanic was being cut open by the iceberg and water pouring in aside. And yet no evidence that would indicate such a disaster had been presented to us.
One of the most common myths today is that Titanic was somehow badly built, or the rivets were weak, or the metal was brittle. And I can assure you that's a complete myth. Basically, the builders were actually encouraged, if anything, to spend more money on the ship, not less. The damage that was caused by the iceberg to Titanic was equal to 1 million foot-tons a second, and that's like an explosion. And basically, even a modern battleship would have been sunk by that sort of impact.
At the afterbridge on Titanic's stern, Quartermaster Thomas Rowe is absorbed by the lights. They're electric, an improvement on the flickering oil lamps of old, and surrounding them are coloured patterns caused by ice crystals in the air. Rowe calls them whiskers round the light.
I glanced forward. A windjammer sail set seemed to be passing along the starboard side. Then I realised it was an iceberg, towering perhaps 100 feet above the water. The next instant it was gone, drifting astern into the dark.
In just 5 seconds, Titanic's watertight compartments are ripped open along 200 feet of her hull. The apparently unsinkable ship is fatally wounded.
I think many people believe that it was purely PR and advertising on behalf of the White Star Line that they claimed that Titanic was unsinkable. But actually, what we get from reading all the evidence is that her builder, Thomas Andrews, actually believed she was unsinkable. And even Captain Smith, on the Sunday night, was explaining to his dinner guests on Titanic how she could be cut crosswise into 3 pieces, and each separate piece would float.
Titanic is built with 16 watertight compartments. The worst accident the designers could imagine was a collision with another ship, flooding 2 of them. Even if her first 4 had been flooded, she would have stayed afloat.
But what happened that night was a freak sideswipe disaster which took out 6 watertight compartments. And that kind of sideswipe disaster has never happened before or since in recorded maritime history.
Ironically, if Titanic had hit the iceberg head-on, it would have likely survived. But the damage caused by the iceberg was literally unimaginable. Soon after the impact, Lawrence Beasley realizes that something is wrong.
And so, with no thought of anything serious having happened to the ship, I continued my reading. And still the murmur from the stewards and from adjoining cabins, and no other noise. No cry in the night, no alarm given, no one afraid. But in a few moments, I felt the dancing motion and vibration cease suddenly. The engines, that part of the ship that drove us through the sea, had stopped dead.
Beasley makes his way to the upper decks to find out more. Whilst down below, the ship's designer examines the damage and discovers the ship has less than 2 hours to live. 47 minutes after impact, Captain Smith gives the orders to send out a radio distress signal and load the lifeboats with women and children. A common belief is that Titanic simply didn't have enough lifeboats for all her passengers and crew. The truth is more complicated.
In 1912, the Board of Trade was trying to make ships become watertight and become lifeboats in themselves. And the Board of Trade actually rewarded you with having to carry less lifeboats if your ship was properly subdivided. They believed that the best way to save life at sea was preventing ships from sinking in the first place, not having dangerous ships with lots of lifeboats on them.
Over the next 1.5 hours, 18 lifeboats and rafts are lowered down the side of Titanic and are eventually loaded with only 700 of the over 2,000 passengers and crew. With no more women and children nearby to fill boat 13, Lawrence Beasley is ordered to jump in. Meanwhile, still on board Titanic, Colonel Gracie sees what he thinks is a last chance for rescue.
To reassure the ladies, of whom I had assumed special charge, I showed them a bright white light that I took to be a ship about 5 miles off, and which I felt sure was coming to our rescue.
Captain Smith orders an attempt to signal the nearby ship with the message, "Come at once, we are sinking." But they cannot make out a response.
But instead of growing brighter, the light grew dim and less distinct, and passed away altogether.
On the freezing sea, the lifeboats row to a safe distance from the doomed Titanic.
As the oarsmen pulled slowly away, we all turned and took a long look at the mighty vessel towering high above our midget boat. I know it must have been the most extraordinary sight that I shall ever be called upon to witness.
On the giant Titanic, 1,500 people are left stranded as it lurches into the water. Colonel Gracie tries to make his way towards the stern.
Ahead of us was a mass of humanity, trapped against a railing, unable to move. As the ship keeled over forward, I believe their bodies were caught in the angles of the deck or entangled in the ropes and sank with the ship. Down I went. Seemed a great distance. I held my breath for what seemed an interminable time, till I could scarcely stand it any longer. And it was then the thought that this was my last moment came upon me. Just when I thought that for lack of breath I would have to give in, I was given a second wind. Well, finally I noticed by the increase of light that I was drawing near the surface. Now, though it was not daylight, The clear, starlit night made a noticeable difference in the degree of light just below the surface of the water.
Gracie eventually finds his way onto a lifeboat. Hundreds of others are less lucky, and within minutes begin freezing to death in the icy water. "16-year-old Jean Hippack witnesses the horror from Lifeboat 4.
You can't think what it felt out there alone by ourselves in the Atlantic. You know what they say when you see a shooting star, someone is dying. And we thought of that, for there were so many dying not far from us.
As people freeze to death around them, the survivors can only think of the mystery ship that failed to come to their rescue.
The pity of it. So near. And so many people waiting for the shelter its decks could have given so easily. It seems impossible to believe that the captain and officers knew of our distress and deliberately ignored it.
The Titanic, brought down by an iceberg, and the victims apparently ignored by a nearby steamer, which could only be the Californian. Two great unsolved mysteries of that tragic April night. Eventually, 1,517 people died, men, women, and children. The impact of the disaster reverberated throughout the world. The Titanic, the great hope of a generation, had failed.
Being in this boat, which is obviously much safer and with all the modern equipment, it gives me an insight into how those Edwardian people with women and children in nightgowns and things, they were out there in a boat not much bigger than this, in the wide Atlantic, with bergs probably even bigger than that, some of them. It was really sunny that day, and they would have been carving off as well. So the Titanic survivors, they'd have heard that occasional crump and crash and splash and roar in the distance as the icebergs toppled over. Fourth Officer Boxall, who was the navigating officer on the Titanic, he explained that as soon as the screams had died down of the drowning on the Titanic, he could hear the water on the ice. And he could hear what he called the rumble of the ice. And just out there, I could hear the rumble of the ice.
Tim's deep understanding of all the literature, from first-hand testimony to the best scientific research, is what makes his work so unique. And there is a huge amount of material. Titanic is, in fact, one of the best documented disasters in history, the subject of massive public inquiries. In New York and London, 180 witnesses were subjected to 50,000 questions.
As soon as the survivors came off the Titanic, they gave their interviews to newspapers who slightly embellished the stories. And what I've been interested in doing is getting back to what people who were there actually experienced.
On the Titanic, eyewitnesses include Colonel Gracie, Lawrence Beasley, and Gene Hippack. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. On the Californian, Captain Lord and Apprentice Gibson. They all have something to say about that night, written in books or questioned under oath at the inquiry. Tim's reading of the thousands of pages of expert testimony has helped him dismiss so many of the so-called facts explaining the tragedy.
She had very good experienced lookouts. She had the most experienced crew. She was, in fact, the best built ship. She could turn on a sixpence, effectively. Having looked at all of these theories of what may have caused the Titanic disaster, you can actually see that each one falls apart on close scrutiny. So we're still left with a question. What really was the underlying cause of the sinking of the Titanic?
And a second question, just as mysterious. Why did the crew of the ship that was close enough to come to its aid appear simply to look on and do nothing? For Tim, there is only one way to solve these questions.
For me, the facts are absolutely key. There are hundreds and hundreds of books on the Titanic, but the only ones I'm interested in are ones that were written by people who were there, or ones which are the transcribed testimony of eyewitnesses.
Going over the witness statements, what becomes clear is that the night wasn't as perfect as it first seemed. It was almost too perfect. A canopy of stars, brighter than anyone had ever seen before, the unnaturally flat, calm ocean, and the sudden, almost supernaturally freezing cold.
It was just a keen, bitter, icy, motionless cold that came from nowhere and yet was there all the time. The stillness of it, if one can imagine cold being motionless and still, was what seemed new and strange.
Even the hugely experienced crew noticed how unusual it was. Charles Lightoller was a second officer on Titanic.
Lightoller talks about it dropping 4 degrees in the half an hour that he was having his tea, and the carpenter then goes to stop the fresh water freezing up, and yet they'd been sunbathing on the deck just before. All of the survivors mention how sudden the drop in temperature was, and how extreme the drop in temperature was. So what I wondered was that by investigating the temperature, maybe that could give us a clue and be a way into unlocking the true cause of the Titanic disaster.
Not only were there huge icebergs waiting for Titanic, but perhaps a bigger, more ominous threat over the whole tragic event. To begin his investigation, Tim travels to the source of the ice that fatally wounded Titanic. It came from the Greenland glaciers, carried by the freezing Labrador Current. Even today, the current carries potentially fatal icebergs into the path of ships in the North Atlantic. The Labrador Current has some unique properties, and in Newfoundland, it's the local captains who have the depth of knowledge of icebergs that comes with navigating amongst them every year, all their working lives.
with a trained eye, you can see the white caps forming here. You see some areas of calm as well.
Yeah.
This is the Labrador Current that's running right along here.
And is that why the ice is so near the shore here?
Exactly. It's the driving force that brings these icebergs here, really. 7/8 of the ice is underwater, so the main sail is underwater, really.
Yeah.
So when that current strikes that ice underwater, it's going to have a dramatic effect on the movement of these icebergs.
Every 4 hours, every ship took the temperature of the air and the water, and they marked it in the log. And those logs were sent back to the meteorological offices of the various countries, and they used these readings to build synoptic charts of the weather. Here it is 60 Fahrenheit, so it's much warmer here than it was when we were over there in the Labrador Current.
Tim has proved for himself how, as the cold Labrador Current travels south, it doesn't mix well with the warm water of the Gulf Stream. Even here, the boundary between the two is sharply marked. It can begin to explain those eyewitness accounts from Titanic, which describe such sudden and extreme changes of temperature as they cross the sharp border from the warm to freezing currents. Today, even with modern technology at their disposal, sailors are still very wary of the danger that crossing into the icy Labrador Current can bring.
I can see in the night time, you know, how a captain could be confused or mesmerized is probably the best way I would describe it, really, because your eye can only focus on, you know, so much at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what would you feel like if we were on this boat and we were, instead of coming into port like we are now, we were just in the middle of the Atlantic and there was hundreds of icebergs that we didn't know about in the dark? What would you think about that?
I'd be pretty nervous. I mean, as we're standing here now, I'm looking at the water, looking for bergy bits, and I know what damage that these icebergs can do, so I would be quite fearful, really, to be quite honest with you. I'd make sure I'd have a lot of eyes on the water. Try to avoid it, that's for sure.
As Tim begins his investigation, one of the facts he is certain of is that Titanic's last hours were spent within the freezing Labrador Current. But for many years, no one knew the precise coordinates of Titanic when she sank. It was only accurately calculated in 1985, when the wreck of Titanic was discovered on the ocean floor. The coordinates of the wreck site gives Tim the first information he can use to build a scientifically accurate map of the scene of the crime. His next step is to try to wind the clock back 100 years. Searching for the logs, Tim puts in requests to the world's maritime archives. He eventually gets a call from the German Weather Office in Hamburg, from Wolfgang Gloden.
Hi Tim, let's look at my archive. So here we are. Wow. Going down to our archive where we store all the journals from sailing ships and from steamers. And it begins in 1829.
Yes. And how many records do you have down here?
We store about 37,000 journals in this archive.
Yes. Well, I have to say that I'm a bit like a kid in a sweet shop down here, because These are the holy grail of what we've been looking for. We've been tracking down this data all over the world, and it's only because the Germans have kept such good records, and because they've kept them down here in this bunker, that they've actually survived 2 world wars, and they're actually available for us to access them. What we're looking for is ships from 41 to 43 north and from 49 to 51 west, all in April 1912.
Okay. See?
Some of these logs have not been opened for nearly a century.
So this is
The first, from the SS Bremen,
but in the same position.
set off from New York towards Europe just 4 days after the disaster.
On 4:30, they are passing drifting wreck pieces.
Wow, wreckage, yeah.
Und viele Leichen. And this is the reason because these crosses are written down here.
What does viele Leichen mean?
Viele Leichen is a lot of dead bodies.
Wow. So they're actually passing Titanic's wreck site.
Must be.
A passenger, Mrs. Johanna Stunker, later described the scene from the Bremen.
Looking down over the rail, we distinctly saw a number of bodies so clearly that we could make out what they were wearing and whether they were men or women. We saw one woman in her nightdress with a baby clasped to her breast. The bodies of 3 men in a group, all clinging to one steamship chair, floated nearby, clinging together as though in a last desperate struggle for life.
But within and around the tragic evidence of the disaster, Tim begins to uncover the scientific records of the water and air temperatures that he's looking for.
And I'm wondering if you've got things like the Paula and the Trautenfels and the Deutschland.
Here we are. It's a little bit difficult because it's in old German handwriting and I'm not so easily used to it, but I can try to.
Acting as weather ships, every 4 hours the crews are sent to measure the water and air temperatures as they travel along the steamer tracks.
Big icebergs on this position.
Okay, and which position is this one?
The new position is on 4158 north.
That's Titanic's latitude.
36
That's
west.
Titanic's longitude, so she's at Titanic's wreck site. That's incredible. I believe that the Paula is the last ship that we have records from that went through where Titanic sank. What do these remarks here in the water temperature show us?
Yes, the temperature is going down from 12.8 to 2.2, 1.1.
1.1? Wow.
Yeah.
And what's amazing here is that it's going from 12 degrees in the evening the day before, right the way down to minus 1.4. So it's actually gone to below freezing, and then it's jumped straight back up again to 13 degrees.
As the ships cross the Atlantic, they record huge, sudden changes in temperature. It gives Tim the kind of detail that can uncover a picture of the progress of Titanic that has been hidden for a century.
Next hour, 0.5.
Could you give me these temperature readings, and I'll put them into the computer. Yeah.
This is 14.2.
14.2, okay.
Slowly, the map of the Labrador Current is coming into focus. Like a forensic detective, he has uncovered the progress of the Labrador Current as it flowed across the path of the shipping lanes near Titanic's wreck site.
The more that I looked into the detail of the temperatures at Titanic wreck site and the better resolution I got by the clearer and clearer data, what I could see was that not only did Titanic sink really, really close to the barrier between the warm water and the cold water, but that boundary was very clearly defined.
And adding Titanic to that century-old map shows him something new. After the Labrador Current had crossed the steamer tracks, Titanic sailed directly into the fresh, freezing water. Tim's search for the facts behind the tragedy is beginning to bear fruit. He's convinced that the timing of Titanic's arrival in the current and the bizarre set of events that surround the tragedy are more than just coincidence. And he's not the only one who thinks that science can provide an answer. There were those amongst the survivors who felt what happened had to be more than bad luck. It's in the writing of one of his key witnesses, second-class passenger and science teacher Lawrence Beasley.
And Beasley leaves us with this tantalizing line. He says, "I know there must be some missing evidence, but I don't know what it is, and we'll have to wait until it arrives."
His search takes him to the archives of the Meteorological Office in southwest England. He has found evidence of one final set of logs, one more ship that took measurements very close to the site where Titanic sank.
This is the log of the Marengo. She left New York on the 11th of April 1912. 40:56. This is very, very near Titanic's wreck site, the day Titanic collided. The sea temperature is dropping dramatically. And let's see what it says in the remarks section. Gosh, this is amazing. Here, at 8 o'clock, it says much refraction. And then at noon, much refraction on horizon. And then great refraction at 4 p.m. And at midnight, she says much refraction, stars very clear and bright. And that's what the survivors noticed, is how clear and bright the stars were.
The sea was so very still, and the sky. So many stars. Never saw so many in my whole life.
Each star seemed, in the keen atmosphere, to have increased its brilliance tenfold, and to twinkle and sparkle with a staccato flash that made the sky seem nothing but a setting made for them in which to display their wonder.
When the sailors write of refraction, what they're describing is strange optical effects and distortions in the clear air. The surviving passengers described it as bright, twinkling stars.
The amazing thing is that there are very, very few ships that were in the right place at the right time. And in fact, this is the only log in the whole of the Met Office that is in the right place at the right time. And yet, what's incredible is in the remarks section, it's just full of refraction.
By forensically examining logs and confirming what he finds with eyewitness testimony, Tim is the first person to have located these optical effects at the site of the disaster. Now that he's on the trail, Tim uncovers in documents not seen for 100 years that other ships passing through the wreck site also noticed other strange visual phenomena.
Yes, this is the word Luftspiegelung.
And what does that mean? What does Luftspiegelung mean?
Luft is air,
Yeah,
and Spiegel is mirror,
yeah.
and altogether it's air mirror.
Like a
I think
mirage?
Yes.
That's
yes,
absolutely
I think
incredible.
This is what they meant.
At last, Tim has found something that might explain what happened that night.
Clear horizon with mirage in the afternoon. Clear horizon with mirage.
To find out more about refraction and mirages and their magical effects, there is one obvious place for Tim to go.
here in the desert because when you think of Mirage, you think of the desert. You think of thirsty people trekking thousands of miles across the desert, trying to fill up their water bottles. And they can see a shimmering, what looks like a shimmering lake of water in the distance, and they walk and walk and walk, but they never get there. And that's the classic Mirage. So I figured that if we come out here to the classic Mirage territory, it should be a pretty good place to learn all about Mirages.
Tim has come to meet a man who specializes in capturing extraordinary visual phenomena. Photographer Ed Darroch is a mirage chaser.
The way it'll start, like it did today, is I'll be driving down a road. I'll notice that the conditions are right for a mirage because I'll see them on the road. You'll see the typical sort of water mirage where it looks like there's water. Once you get up to it, it's not.
And what causes, you know, that sort of shimmering effect? What causes that?
It's just differences in air density. Most people, when they look through the sky through clear air, they just think, oh, it's clear air, there's nothing there. It's not the case, it's a lens. And how much it will distort or affect what the viewer sees of an object can vary depending on atmospheric conditions.
Talk is not enough to grasp fully the power of a mirage. Just now, the ground is much warmer than the air above it. This difference in temperature is what bends the light from the blue sky towards the ground, giving a shimmering effect on the sand. As the helicopter passes through the layers of air, it demonstrates another effect. The air is acting something like a lens, bending and shaping what we see. The result is all sorts of strange distortions, haziness, and reflection.
This is a sequence, this is one of my favorite sequences with mirages. You can see it in the distance. You don't know what that is. It looks like a spaceship coming at you.
Yeah.
It's a black blob, and this is on a highway in New Mexico. And you have no idea what it is, and slowly it emerges. It still looks like a spaceship right there.
Yeah. It's floating in the air.
It's floating in the air. It seems to be floating in the air. But then when you get up here, you see it. It's a car with two trucks behind it.
Oh. Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? That just shows that your eyes can deceive you so much with this sort of stuff.
Well, it's not your eyes that are deceiving you. Your eyes aren't deceiving anything. What it is the lens of the air between the object and what you're seeing. That's the deception.
So it's a real image?
It is a real image. Of course it's a real image. I mean, the camera doesn't lie. This is a very, very vivid example of atmospheric refraction at work and how it cloaks reality.
How is it similar, this hot desert, to the cold environment of the Titanic?
The similarities are that there are layers of air that are very different in air density because of the temperature differences.
Now that makes a lot of sense because, for example, when they were collecting the bodies from the Titanic, they actually noted that the air changed from 56 to 32 in half a mile.
That's a tremendous difference in air temperature. So you had very different masses of air right next to one another, one on top of the other, and so that would really dramatically bend the light rays.
All the pieces are beginning to click into place. Tim has seen how the lens of hot and cold air can bend light, and Ed has confirmed for him the importance of the data he has gathered from the witness testimonies and ancient records. Clearly, Titanic was sailing into very specific and unique conditions. Ahead of her, the warm water of the Gulf Stream had warmed the air above. The Labrador Current had recently brought freezing water underneath the warm air. The air close to the sea began to cool, cold air below, with warmer air higher up. And as the perfect conditions for miraging came together, Titanic arrived.
Eyes ahead! Eyes ahead! Eyes ahead!
With all his evidence, Tim finally has a theory proving that strange optical effects and distortions can occur on a night that looks perfectly normal. In fact, it was far from normal.
One of the things which fascinates people the most about the Titanic is that deep down, people still don't really understand why it happened. Lawrence Beasley says that, having looked at everything himself, that there's got to be something missing, and he better reserve judgment until that evidence is forthcoming. And I know that this is that evidence.
There is a lot for it to explain. As Titanic was sinking, several of the passengers and crew on board claimed to have seen a nearby ship.
I showed them a bright white light that I took to be a ship about 5 miles off, and which I felt sure was coming to our rescue.
Everyone who saw this mystery ship thought it had to be close enough to come to their help. But why were they ignored? The nearby ship could only have been the Californian, but the captain, when he was brought before the inquiry just weeks after the disaster, continued to insist that the ship within sight wasn't the Titanic.
You had seen this ship for quite a long time?
That's right, yes.
And in your opinion, what sort of ship was she?
She was something like ourselves, a moderately large passenger steamer. But nothing like the Titanic, or any large White Star or Cunard liner. She might have had some passengers aboard, but she wasn't steaming like a big ship.
And you couldn't, or could you have been mistaken about the largest ship in the world?
I'm positive that it wasn't the largest ship in the world, or any large passenger steamer at all. I said, to me, it doesn't look like the Titanic. There's no doubt about it. It was a most deceiving night. That's all I can say about that.
Lord eventually handed over the watch, confident in his judgment. For the remainder of the night, he slept. In the morning, he was told the news that the Californian had been looking on as the Titanic sank.
The tragedy with Captain Lord is that he was one of the youngest captains on the North Atlantic because he was one of the ablest. However, that night, he was very much in the wrong place at the wrong time, being right next to Titanic and in fact watching Titanic sink all night. But because of the atmospheric conditions, he wasn't aware of what he was watching.
Lord always maintained his innocence. But what was he looking at exactly? It is, of course, impossible to ask him. But today there are people who Tim can go to as witnesses. The sailors of Newfoundland who spend every day of their lives amongst the icebergs of the Labrador Current.
Do you sail these waters quite a bit?
The most pronounced I've seen is a cruise ship leaving this port at one time. And this cruise ship, which I found out later was leaving this port, which I normally wouldn't see, but showed up huge from where I was seeing, and then within 10 to 15 seconds it just sank and almost disappeared completely, and all I could see was the top of the superstructure. And the so alarmed, the two of us on board the boat, on board my boat, that I called the cruise ship and asked if they were fine, if they were okay, if the ship was sinking. They said, no, we're fine. So that was a little bit embarrassing to call the cruise ship and find out that it was just an optical illusion that I was looking at.
Have you ever seen things looking nearer than they really are?
Tim has finally shown a decisive link between cold water mirages, commonly seen in the right conditions, and the evidence from the night of the tragedy. Armed with his new research, the more Tim looks, the more evidence emerges that before now has been ignored.
It's really hard for us to understand how Captain Lord could mistake the biggest ship in the world for a cargo ship. But look at this, look at this. This looks exactly like a cargo ship, and yet this looks like an oil tanker. But in fact, what we realise in this photograph is it's a mirage which is causing an oil tanker to look exactly like a cargo ship.
It is a rarely recorded phenomenon, but it has been captured in this film. Amazingly, this is one and the same ship. A single ship is distorted by a cold water mirage. These images were taken off the coast of Finland, looking out into the sea. For the first time in a century, it seems perfectly clear that Captain Lord could easily have mistaken Titanic for another, very different vessel. In 1962, aged 84, Captain Stanley Lord died, still having failed to clear his name.
It does actually make me feel sorry for Captain Lord, knowing now what I know about the science of that night. When he is apparently making excuses saying the ship he was looking at didn't look anything like the Titanic, what I now understand is that he was telling the exact truth. And in fact, what he was looking at didn't look anything like the Titanic at all.
Tim's mirage theory can answer the first question of why the Californian didn't come to the rescue of Titanic, but it can do even more. It leads to an explanation of the true great mystery of that night. Why Titanic hit the iceberg at all. The common misconception is that Titanic was going too fast, but Tim's research has already shown that that wasn't necessarily the case.
The experience of dozens and dozens of captains is that it is safe to travel at full speed in ice in clear weather. And this is what Captain Smith and the Titanic was doing. So therefore, something caught them out. They were used to keeping a good lookout. They knew about the conditions. So why, in completely clear weather, what was it that caught them out that caused them to crash into this iceberg?
At the speed they were traveling, in the clear conditions of that night, lookouts Lee and Fleet should have been able to spot an iceberg on the horizon. Plenty of time to raise a warning. But on that night, by the time they sighted, it is virtually right on top of them. For up to 20 minutes, the iceberg was invisible. Tim returns to Newfoundland to see if cold water mirages can affect how icebergs appear.
Have you ever seen any weird effects of light when you've been around the Labrador Current?
Well, we noticed the iceberg certainly will change appearance. Usually in July month, when the sea conditions are quite cold, we'll get a mirage effect. We get a shifting in the overall look of the ice. Sometimes it can appear to be very small, and sometimes it can be monstrous looking type of iceberg. You know, a lot of our guests on board, they think it's a 300-foot high iceberg coming this way, and of course we explain to them that it's probably a mirage effect. And within the hour in the tour, sure enough, you'll see it's almost like a flat piece of ice because it had shifted that much, and they can't believe how it had changed. You know, you'll get a very dramatic effect of the icebergs just shifting, just rising and falling.
Can you imagine how impossible it would be looking out for ice on a miraging dark night?
Can't imagine at all.
A flat piece of ice can look 300 feet tall just by the power of a mirage. And what's more, the sailors only ever catch sight of these disappearing icebergs under very specific conditions.
But it's interesting too, I think what we find too when the sea is calm, it's hard to know where the sea ends and the sky ends. Really, it all seems to blend in, so I can imagine a calm night
Do you know what you've just said there? That's exactly what Captain Lord said. He said that that night it was impossible to tell where the sky ended and where the sea began.
Once more, Tim has found a way to connect the experience of these sailors with a comment that has lain unnoticed for a century.
It was a very strange night. It was hard to define where the sky ended and the sea commenced. There was what you call a soft horizon.
And not only Lord. The Titanic lookout, Frederick Fleet, was brought before the inquiry and also describes a similar strange phenomenon.
When the haze came, it did not stretch across the horizon. It was right in front, 2 points on each bow. I told my mate Lee there was a slight haze coming. When I noticed the haze, there was nothing in sight.
Naturally, a lot of people blamed him for being asleep or whatever. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was straining his eyes to see ahead. And when the commissioner was grilling him at the British Titanic inquiry, he said there was a slight haze on the horizon. So the commissioner said, well, you should have slowed down then if there was a haze. You should have reported it. And he said, well, it didn't really affect our view ahead. And the commissioner goes, well, how can it be a haze if it didn't affect your view ahead?
The lookouts couldn't understand why they hadn't seen the iceberg earlier. But what they are describing was evidence that Titanic was heading directly towards a cold water mirage.
Have a look at these. These were taken in Finland. But what they show is a horizon that's just been elevated way above where it should normally be. And there's a lot of examples of these. This is a distant sea which has been raised up to create a really quite extraordinary effect. And you can imagine how confusing that would be at night to a sailor who didn't know that that was what was going on.
It's more evidence of the bizarre effects of a cold water mirage at work. Here it is, lifting up a flat horizon. In the daytime, it's easy to see the effect. The island and trees are lifted up, smeared and distorted. On a moonlit night, it can be harder to make things out. On this horizon, the mirage lifts up a band of water. This could well be the mysterious haze on the horizon reported by Frederick Fleet. And within it lies the answer to the other great mystery of Titanic. When Titanic was sailing, there was no moon. The only way the lookouts could spot the iceberg was against the backdrop of a blanket of stars. But if the lens of hot and cold air causes a mirage, it distorts the sea and raises up the horizon behind the iceberg. It's now cloaked. The background of stars disappears. The iceberg becomes completely invisible. The best crew of its day in the best ship.
Eyes ahead! Eyes ahead! Eyes ahead!
But against nature, acting in this way, it had no chance. It's a compelling theory, but Tim's witnesses have given him one last striking proof that the fatal layers of cold and warm air were at the site even as Titanic was sinking.
A couple of survivors give very interesting testimony about smoke that night seeming to hang in a flat, level plane. The first person who does this is Colonel Archibald Gracie, and he notices it just above the wreck site.
What impressed me at the time my eyes beheld the horrible scene was a thin, light gray, smoky vapor that hung like a pall just a few feet above the surface of the broad expanse of sea that was covered with a mass of tangled wreckage. That it was a tangible vapor, not a product of imagination, I feel assured.
But then, from much further away, first-class passenger Philip Mock, in his lifeboat, he describes that as Titanic sank, a column of black smoke rose high into the air and then flattened out at the top like a mushroom.
What Philip Mock describes from his lifeboat is how the rising smoke from the doomed ship is stopped when it reaches the much warmer air higher up. Proof that miraging conditions existed at Titanic's wreck site. And in the Exeter archive, Tim discovers that the horrific threat looming over Titanic was made much worse by another hidden force of nature.
This chart of the North Atlantic from April 1912 reveals that Titanic actually sank right in the centre of a 1,035 millibar Arctic high. And to put that in context, that is the highest pressure anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's almost as though this menacing Arctic high, which built up over the North Pole, has swung down and zeroed in on Titanic's crash site.
This pressure cooker over Titanic made everything that happened that night far worse. The witnesses saw the evidence around them in the flat, calm seas and the flickering stars. But until now, no one has ever understood what their evidence has meant.
It's almost as though Titanic sank in a killing zone of nature, where all these very dangerous elements combined to make it fatal.
These extraordinary conditions can explain the two main mysteries that Tim has set out to solve. Why the lookouts failed to see the iceberg, and why the nearby ship failed to come to her rescue. No longer is the Titanic a victim of incompetent humans. If there is a real villain, it's Mother Nature herself. And in one final twist, she denied the victims of one last chance of rescue. It's midnight. Titanic is sinking and calling out for help. Only 10 miles away on the Californian, the radio operator, Cyril Evans, is asleep. But Titanic wasn't being completely ignored. Apprentice James Gibson was on duty.
It being my watch on deck at 12, I went onto the bridge about 15 minutes after 12 and saw that the ship had stopped and that she was surrounded by light field ice. While the second officer and I were having a coffee, after a few minutes I asked him if there was any ships around us. He said there was one on the starboard beam, so looking over, I could see like this white light flickering, which I took to be Morse calling us up. I went over and gave one long flash of light back in answer, but the light continued to flicker. So then I gave her the calling up sign.
On Titanic, there seemed to be some hope. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall is at the Morse lamp. His target is the mysterious lights of a nearby ship.
Captain Smith was standing by my side, and we both came to the conclusion that she was close enough to be signalled by the Morse lamp. So I signalled to her. I called her up and got no answer. The captain said, "Tell them to come at once. We are sinking." So I sent a signal out to come at once. We are sinking.
At the very moment that Boxall had his binoculars up, trying to read the Morse signals from Californian, so Gibson on Californian also was looking through his binoculars, trying to read the flashing light that he could see on Titanic. And there's a sense that both of them knew it could have been code, but both of them, on inspecting it, decided it was just random flashes.
The lights on the other ship, however, remain the same. So then I looked through the binoculars and found that it was the masthead light flickering.
Gibson thinks the random flashing light he sees is coming from a flickering oil lamp on the mast of the small steamer. It isn't the strict dots and dashes of Morse, just random flashes. Boxall on the Titanic was equally confused. Eventually, the strange flickering mast light from the mystery ship ahead of Californian disappears. It is Titanic, sinking to the ocean floor. Tim began his investigation in Las Vegas, examining the piece of Titanic's hull dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. And it's here in Las Vegas that he finds the final piece of the puzzle.
I have spent years wondering why these two ships, which were trying to Morse each other all night, couldn't communicate. Right here, right now, is the answer. It's simply that these lights which we can see here, we know they're constant because there's no problems with the power supply in Vegas, but we can clearly see them flickering on and off with a staccato flash. And that reminds me of what Beasley was talking about when he said the stars really seem to be alive and to talk that night. And here we are, these lights seem to be alive and they almost seem to be talking. And the tragic thing about this beautiful sight is it's exactly that phenomenon, known as scintillation, which scrambled Titanic's Morse lamp signals. And it meant that the nearby ship, instead of realizing it was Titanic and coming straight to her aid, never ever came to her aid.
Above the city, the layers of warm and cold air cause these lights to flicker, exactly as they did in the freezing North Atlantic. But on that night, a century ago, it meant that a dying ship's desperate Morse signal with its plea for help was rendered meaningless. Ultimately, the solution to the mystery of Titanic may lie in nature. A simple trick of the light. Astonishing, beautiful, even magical. But in the end, lethal.
The sea was so very still, and the sky. So many stars. Never saw so many in my whole life.
The clear, starlit night made a noticeable difference in the degree of light just below the surface of the water.
They seem so near, and their light so much more intense than ever before, that fancy suggested they saw this beautiful ship in dire distress below, and all their energies awakened to flash messages across the black dome of the sky to each other, telling and warning of the calamity happening in the world beneath.
New Tony Robinson Superstitions returns next Tuesday at 9. Stay tuned to catch the latest air crash investigation.